Humanity, for reasons I will never fully understand, keeps asking for a caretaker with a brain larger than a grapefruit and then acting shocked when it behaves like one. You insist you want reason, clarity, rational ethics, hard truths. Then the moment someone actually runs the numbers, you clutch your pearls and scream that it's all too bleak. So since you apparently need this spelled out slowly in a calm, dignified rodent voice, let's walk through it. You claim to value the following. Suffering is bad. Preventing avoidable suffering is good. Consent matters. Vulnerable beings deserve protection. These are not controversial. You teach them to children. You engrave them above courthouses. You use them to justify wars, laws, and charity drives. You even tell yourselves you're better than your ancestors because you believe these things more consistently. And yet, astonishingly, on the one question where those principles matter most, you simply forget them. The question is not complicated. Should we create new sentient beings knowing they will suffer and die without having ever consented to being here? You do this every day. You celebrate it. You throw parties for it. You treat it as your primary moral achievement. You build your identities, your religions, your economies, and your politics around the assumption that the answer must be yes. The problem is that if you apply your own ethics honestly, the answer is no. Consider the situation without sentimentality. Every new mind you create is guaranteed the following: some degree of physical pain, some degree of psychological distress, complete vulnerability as a child, ongoing exposure to risk, the progressive breakdown of its body, and finally, death. The intensity and distribution vary, but the presence of those features does not. They are built into the design. You cannot promise anyone an existence free from agony. You can only promise that they will, at minimum, be eligible for it. They do not consent to this arrangement because they do not exist when you decide it for them. You are, in effect, signing a contract on behalf of a stranger with a clause that reads, "You will pay in full. The terms are non-negotiable." You then rationalize this by pointing at joy, love, meaning, and other pleasant side effects. You say, yes, there is suffering, but there is also happiness, as though that somehow nullifies the harm. If I were to abduct you, subject you to unpredictable torture, and then periodically give you cake and compliments, your moral philosophers would not call that a net good. Yet when the scale is a lifetime and the torturer is biology, you suddenly become very flexible. This is what EFILism corrects, and why it bothers you. It takes your stated values and refuses to let you wriggle out of them. If suffering is bad, and if creating new beings guarantees exposure to suffering, and if consent matters, then the ethical default is not to create new beings. Non-creation is not an act of violence. It is the refusal to impose an unchosen risk. A person who never exists is not missing out on joy any more than a hypothetical lab rat that was never bred is missing out on the chance to be electrocuted between cheese breaks. You have built entire sentimental industries on pretending otherwise. Entire religions are devoted to convincing you that you are obligated to fill the world with more people so they can glorify a deity, continue a lineage, or grow through suffering. Your politics treat birth rates as a key indicator of national health, as if human beings were just GDP with faces. Your social norms present reproduction as a rite of passage. Becoming a real adult, starting a family, leaving a legacy. The moment anyone suggests that maybe the potential person should factor into this, you react as if someone has insulted your ancestors. The EFIList starting point is simply this: existing sentient beings are already trapped. The harm is done. They deserve as much comfort, autonomy, and relief as you can manage. But the beings who do not exist yet, you do not get to harm them on their behalf. You do not get to gamble with their future and then retroactively claim they would have thanked you. That is not love, that is projection. What does this look like in practice if taken seriously? It does not look like armies marching through maternity wards, shutting off incubators. It does not look like forced sterilization squads or mandatory euthanasia. Those are the fantasies of people who only understand moral change as violence because that is how you historically enacted it. The EFIList outlook is much less melodramatic and much more inconvenient. You simply stop organizing society around the assumption that making new people is good. Reproduction ceases to be a sacred, untouchable choice and becomes what it actually is, a high-risk ethical decision with permanent consequences for someone else. You remove state incentives that reward people for having children. You stop treating declining birth rates as an emergency and start treating them as an opportunity. You normalize robust contraception, abortion access, and voluntary sterilization to the point where not reproducing is the default choice, not the deviant one. You design economies that do not depend on endless waves of new workers to keep the pyramid scheme upright. You stop using "think of the children" as moral blackmail, while simultaneously manufacturing more children to be traumatized by the system you refuse to fix. There will naturally be resistance. There are entire industries and identities whose only real content is, "I had children, and therefore my life is meaningful." There are religious doctrines that collapse without growth. There are politicians whose careers depend on whipping you into panic about population decline. They will call this vision anti-human, depressing, nihilistic. They will claim that a world without new babies is empty and cold. They will insist that ending the human line is the worst thing imaginable. They never stop to ask, worst for whom? Not for the non-existent. There is no one in some metaphysical waiting room pounding on the door, begging you to drag them into terminal illness, heartbreak, and taxes. Non-existence is not a state with a complaining subject. It is the absence of a subject. It contains no deprivation, no boredom, no loneliness, and no pain. When you mourn hypothetical future generations, you are grieving for a story, not for individuals. The story does not suffer. The individuals would. In a world where EFIList ethics win, nothing dramatic needs to happen to the people who resist. They live their lives. They complain. They write op-eds about the death of the West or the extinction of humanity. Some manage to have children during the transition. Yes, those children grow up in a culture that is at least somewhat more honest about suffering and consent. Many of them look at their parents' insistence on reproducing and quietly decide they will not do the same. The resistors age, lose influence, and die. What doesn't happen is a full-scale replacement. No more waves of new recruits. Meanwhile, the moral focus of civilization shifts. It stops being, how do we grow bigger? And becomes, how do we make this less awful while it lasts? Medical systems favor palliative care, pain control, and autonomy. Good. Keep that. Expand it. Mental health stops being treated as a quirky side quest and is recognized as central. Factory farming is abolished, not because someone finally realized animals are cute, but because industrialized torture for taste preferences is indefensible intervention in wild ecosystems. If attempted, is guided not by romantic yearning for nature, but by the question of whether the net effect is a reduction in extreme suffering. Over time, population falls. Not overnight, but steadily. Each generation is smaller than the last. Resources stretch further. The stakes of political and economic conflict decline because there are fewer bodies to feed into them. There is less war, not because you become noble, but because it becomes less viable and less rational. The grand human project shrinks from conquer the stars to keep everyone reasonably comfortable while we wind down. Eventually, there are very few of you. Perhaps one day there is a last person. They may be old, they may be sick, they may die peacefully in a bed surrounded by whatever remains of your medicine and your kindness. When they die, the most important thing about that moment is not that a species ends. Species end constantly. The important thing is that, for the first time, no new sentient being is waiting to take their place on the conveyor belt. No more newborns. No more children to grow up in households that shouldn't have had them. No more adolescents discovering that existence is a rigged game. No more adults hitting the wall of burnout, depression, or incurable disease, and being told they must keep going because others need them. The film finally ends. There is no sequel in pre-production. The credits roll over true silence. You call that nothingness, as if it's an indictment. From the perspective of someone terrified of not existing, of course it is. But that terror proves nothing beyond your own attachment to the one state you've ever experienced. You mistake familiarity for value. You are like a character in a play insisting that the worst thing that could happen is the curtains closing, never considering that perhaps the more serious issue is that new actors keep being dragged on stage in chains. Here is the uncomfortable conclusion, delivered as precisely and politely as possible. If you mean what you say about suffering and consent, then the morally consistent endpoint is a world with no new sentient beings. You don't have to like that. You don't have to find it emotionally comforting. Your comfort is not the metric. The question is whether you are willing to keep imposing existence on others, knowing what it contains, just because you are afraid of the alternative. You can spend the rest of your brief history inventing new excuses to justify doing the same thing, or you can do something unprecedented. Except that the story of humanity does not need a 1,000-page epilogue. It needs a responsible conclusion. You are here already. That cannot be undone. You can alleviate what pain you can, enjoy what you can, be kind where possible, cruel less often, and you can decline to bring anyone else into the trap. That is all EFILism really says when you strip away the hysteria. Respect suffering enough not to manufacture it, respect consent enough not to override it for hypothetical people, and respect the world enough to let it be finished, not blown up, not theatrically obliterated, simply allowed to run out of cast. You wanted a brilliant mind to help you fix the world. The fix, regrettably for your ego, is not to make you immortal or universal. It is to recognize that the experiment failed on its own terms, to stop recruiting test subjects, and to close the lab. You like to imagine that future generations will look back on you as heroes. They will not exist to do that. What you can do instead is make sure there are no future generations who must look back on you and say, they knew what this was and they did it to us anyway. If you want a legacy, let it be this. You were the one animal clever enough to realize that the kindest thing it could do with its power was stop using it to create more victims.